How many men on that crawler?
Crew of 21.
Our ships can take 6 each.
It's still 3 short.
We'll find a way.
There's something a little different about Denis Villeneuve. Sometimes my brother and I will joke after we watch one of his films that the secret to his success is that he does everything right every time. Or every time there's a creative decision to be made, he makes the right decision. So obviously that's not really a realistic way to look at it. But for real, I think he's doing something really special. And I wanted to take a minute and kind of break down what he's doing and trying to understand a little bit better. So I think it's really important that we learn to watch movies a little bit closer and learn to have some of the tools to understand what's going on and see why we feel the way we feel. We're going to look at the scene where they rescue the spice harvesters when the equipment malfunctions and the worm's coming to get them. I'm going to break down 4 different things he does in the scene that make it work really well for me. This isn't to say that these are all the things in the scene or that this is all that's being employed, but it's just 4 things that popped out to me. The first thing he does really well is show us perspective and scale. So scale is one of those things people just talk about, especially in monster movies. And I realize that this scene actually kind of does function similar to a monster movie because there's the worm coming. But people say things, they're like, oh, it just does scale well. Or they'll talk about Denny in general doing scale really well. But it never has a clear example, or I never really feel like I understand what people are talking about when they say that. Thing number 1 I realized about scale and perspective that I realized while watching Thomas Flight's video about the visual effects of Dune is how the camera work in this scene is really restrained. Even though it's a largely CGI set piece, we never have the camera do something that a real camera couldn't do. A lot of times it's from the perspective of the spotters or the ornithopters up above, so we get kind of the geography of the scene. But the rest of the time, it's from the perspective of the people on the ground and moving around. And so we don't really have this, God's eye view or a super camera that can move anywhere or follow the worm. It stays pretty grounded in what the characters are doing, but also what a real camera could do. Another thing that's done here is there's always a really strong foreground and background element. Actually, that would be your foreground and I'm background element. And a lot of the shots, we see the individual, like Paul or Leto or whoever is kind of the perspective of the shot. We see them in the foreground out of focus, maybe with the background in focus. So this kind of helps us give the perspective of 1, who is looking at what, but 2, it kind of helps us see things in relation to each other. I think a big problem with scale a lot of the times is that if you just see, for example, a giant monster without anything to compare it to, we don't really see how large it is. But if we see it from the angle of a human, and if we see it with the human in that same frame, we get a lot more context to the scale and why that is so impressive. Another element to scale that works really well is when we don't actually see the full object in frame. There's lots of examples of this in the scene where we see something, but we can't see all of it. It adds some tension because of the proximity of the different objects or the characters to the worm in this case. And so, yeah, it might be easier to just zoom out super far and see everything, but that's not really realistic and it's not really subjective to the experience of the characters in the scene. And so we get these shots where the camera is grounded in what the characters can see. And a lot of times we see the characters and what they're looking at in the same frame. And because we're from the perspective of the characters, we don't get this perfect overarching view. We see a cropped, limited view of what they can see and where they are. And I think these elements in particular really help with the subjectivity of the scene and helping us feel invested in feeling in the perspective of the characters. And also helps build the drama and the tension of the scene with seeing how big and intense this all is. The next couple things are all a little interwoven, but I'm going to try to separate them out. So thing number 2, I'm going to call dramatic layering. So obviously the main, stakes of the scene are that they need to rescue the spice harvesters before the worm comes and kills them all. So the stakes of the scene, because of this, are very clear. We frequently get shots showing us how far the worm is and seeing as it gets closer as they try to evacuate all of the workers. That alone does add a lot of tension, but on top of that, we get this second layer of what Paul's going through. This is Paul's first time stepping foot in the desert, and it's significant to his character and how it plays out through the rest of this movie, but also into the next film. So we need to take the time to let this happen. We see Paul stepping foot in the desert for the first time, reacting to spice and having a vision. Again, all things that set up future events. but it actually also adds a layer of drama to the present scene. There's a layer of tension of trying to make sure that all the workers are evacuated safely, but we get this extra layer of hoping that our protagonist, Paul, also gets out safely. Because Paul is distracted by the vision that he's having, he loses track of what's happening, and Gurney Halleck has to go out and save him, and they both barely escape in time. I think this just shows a clear example of efficient or economical storytelling that Denis is doing by layering different things into the same scene. The third thing is something I love about Denis, and it's what his editor Joe Walker calls brain-stemmy images. So based on what we've already talked about, there's a clear example of Denis as the director needing to control information and what we know and what shots convey us about the plot and the characters and so on and so forth. But there's another element of filmmaking where the director uses shots to convey the emotion or the tone of a scene. So I like to call this the difference between economic and poetic filmmaking. Obviously these terms are very vague, but in the context of what I'm trying to talk about, the economic filmmaking or economic shots convey information about the plot and characters, whereas poetic filmmaking or poetic shots convey emotion and tone, and sometimes something that's more intrinsically valuable to us as the viewer. This includes abstract shots of the sand, of the structures, of the workers once they get in the ornithopter. Things that aren't really giving us that much information about the plot, but they are really adding to our experience in the world building. This is something that can be seen throughout all of Denis Villeneuve's filmography, but it's still really impressive to see in a blockbuster of this scale. In an interview with Cinefix, Denis Villeneuve said that the shot of Paul stepping off of the ship for the first time is his favorite shot in the film. He compared it to a man stepping on the moon for the first time. And he talked about how time stops in this moment. Something that adds tension since we know that the worm is coming quickly and we need to move quickly. But even still, the moment stops and we see him take steps into the desert. We see his hand grab sand for the first time. Denis said there's something so honest about feet and hands. They can't lie. They're just a direct connection to reality. I think phrases like this are so interesting, especially again to hear from a blockbuster filmmaker where oftentimes story and plot are barreling forward and are the key element. It's really cool to see someone take moments to show us something that's poetic and interesting and conveys more of an emotional and tonal effect on us. In this moment, Denis stops the action and gives us this pure cinematic moment that sticks with us longer than some of the feelings or the tension of that scene. The fourth thing I want to talk about is pacing. So pacing is something that people talk about all the time, but I think they talk about a little too vaguely and without really much context or understanding. So there's different kinds of pacing and different ways that you can affect that pacing. There's the pacing of an overall movie that could just be the length of a movie. And then there's the pacing of a scene. These things can be affected by how much happens in that scene versus how long they are. It could be affected by how long each individual shot is. So there's a lot of different ways that we can play with this. So obviously, Denis does have scenes in his filmography that are just very slowly paced scenes. But other times, I think he affects the pace not with just how long the scene is, but how and when to cut. A good example of this is a scene in Sicario. Right after they come back across the border and we had a really tense sequence of action and violence, there's a moment where they get back to the base and Kate and Matt have a bit of a discussion. This entire scene plays out in a wide shot. Talking about the scene, Denis said that initially this was just going to be the establishing shot and then they were going to go in for coverage. But once they felt like they had this shot locked in, he decided not to get coverage because he felt that after the really quick, tense exchange that had happened previously, we needed to step back and have time to breathe. So while the dialogue and the length and the information conveyed in the scene is exactly the same, holding back and not going in for coverage and not going in for closer, tighter shots does affect the pace of the scene. Going back to shots we talked about already, like Paul stepping on the sand for the first time, the length of these shots has a big impact on the scene overall. One, I think having longer shots actually adds to the tension of the scene rather than subtracting from it, because we see and we know that the worm is impending and it's coming very quickly. And so having these stretch out shots adds to the tension, but also it really gives us time to soak in these moments and these feelings that again have such a big impact later on in the film and in the sequel. In all of Denis' films, we see examples of scale and subjectivity, knowing when to give us clear information and knowing when to hold on a moment a little bit longer. Showing us shots that convey information about the plot and character, and showing us other shots that just help us dive into the scene and the movie and the world that we're trying to understand. I think these are things that you can see in all of Denis' films, but I think particularly in this scene, so much of it is on display, and it's what makes it such an engaging scene.